postmodernism today, and this is what we'll do. We'll first go through an exposition and ask what the fundamental claims are. And those claims are about knowledge and power, categories and their effects, facts and representation, and causality versus meaning. All of it will become clearer as we move along. And then we will evaluate the claims. First we lay out what the claims are, which is what we should do before we critique. You must read Das Kapital first before you criticize Marx. That's the claim. So let's lay out the main claims, the principal claims, and then we will evaluate one of these streams of evaluation we have touched upon, the last one, what is explained better by constructivism, and that idea will appear here as well, identity formation of violence. But two will be new. One, we'll ask whether postmodernism and constructivism are two sides of the same coin, or postmodernism is qualitatively different. It's a very different way. If it's a part of the constructivist family, it is a very different kind of child. It's very different from constructivist children. It might be part of the same family. Not all children are alike. Some could be fundamentally different from others. And we'll also ask a question about, since truth, the idea of truth is heavily debated within postmodernism. Those of you who've read Foucault know that's almost central to the claim that there is no the truth. So we will ask questions about, even if that claim is true, does that apply to historical truth or contemporary truth? We'll ask that question. So let's start with the key postmodernist claims. Some will be put in a very generic manner. This will apply to all postmodernist forms of scholarship, and then we'll quickly move after this to implications for ethnic conflict and identity formation. First, the fundamental claim is that power relations are deeply implicated in the formation of knowledge. From that follows the second point. Much of what passes for objective or scientific knowledge, especially in the human sciences, so much of what passes for objective knowledge, especially in the human sciences, it's worth asking whether this would apply to the harder sciences as well, or physical sciences as well, as sometimes called, or the so-called the sciences as well. Much of what passes, at least passes for objective knowledge, scientific knowledge in the human sciences, is basically a narrative. Basically a narrative, the claim that appears again and again, a claim that has entered mainstream ways of talking about phenomena. The term narrative was not so popular as it is until the constructivists and postmodernists entered our intellectual life. It's a narrative constructed, very important term, by the knowledge elite, another important term, and promoted by institutions of power. Science, at least in the social and human sciences, is basically a narrative created by the elite, supported by institutions of power. Oxford, Cambridge, Harvard, JNU in its leftist phase, when Indian government was leftist, let's say, etc. Vivekananda Institute today, which has produced a number of bureaucrats for the Modi government, and some scholars as well. So that's the idea here, just a flavor of that. Right? Alternative forms of knowledge were suppressed in history, for they were associated with pre-modern ways of knowing and patronized by those who had very little power in society. Who wrote the history of peasants? Peasants themselves? No. Who wrote the history of colonial peoples, at least to begin with? The colonized masters. Who wrote the history of women? Women? No. Men wrote the history of women. Right? The turn towards feminist history, the turn towards looking at peasant songs and right, the turn towards looking at the diaries of courtesans in the 16th century, 17th century courts. That's all new turn. That's a new turn in scholarly inquiry, historical inquiry, right? Using the peasant songs to write about peasants, using women's diaries to write about women. This is a new turn in scholarly history. Overall, until this new phase, these histories were written, or the knowledges about peasants were produced by lords and scholars who connected to lords and governments. Knowledge about women, similarly, by men, who were, and that knowledge produced by institutions of power, and so on and so forth. Dominant narratives and categories used by them are not simply abstract matters. They create social, political, cultural effects of their own. Categories have real-world consequences. The biggest component of this third larger point is the census. Exhaustively studied now. The categories that the census used that generated new forms of consciousness, or at the very least solidified forms of consciousness that were fuzzy. So the great Ashish Nandi example, 1911 census, everyone should know that example, and I'll be happy to send you the page number of the article where it appears, because you'll get the exact numbers. How many thousand Hindus and Muslims said, when asked by British census takers whether they were Hindus or Muslims, they said, we are Hindu Muslim. Right? Presumably, that was 1911, presumably in 1711, many times more people, when asked whether they were Hindu or Muslim, said Hindu Muslim. Right? But the census insisted, right? By 1921, the census insisted you have to pick only one category. Only one category. And indeed, in the 1911 census, it's only in some parts of India that they allowed this term, we are Hindu Muslim. In many other parts, they insisted you pick only one category. Which then generated a whole stream of, a solidification of an identity that was not so clear. Or radical clarity about an identity that was not so clear, and it's not clear that radical clarity is always a virtue. Right? Is it the same as constructivism? And it is not, and here is the ground for saying so. Benedict Anderson, whose work we concentrated on because of its great intellectual, scholarly significance, seminal, would not argue that nationalism as a master narrative arose in the West or elsewhere merely because it suited the interests of the elite. If anything, he argues that by involving the masses and posing challenges to the existing dynastic and ecclesiastical elite, nationalism sought to undermine the old order. Nationalism was about vernaculars, about involving the masses, dynastic and ecclesiastical. The princely order and the religious order. The elites of those two orders were the elites of society. Nationalism undermined them. Or they had to respond to nationalism, incorporate. It's not that the king of Britain fell, but the king of Britain had to then represent the British spirit. British national spirit. Had to make room for that. Had to then concede also power to representatives of the people. Right? There is in the Benedict Andersonian formulation of nationalism, there is also a great connection between Protestantism and nationalism. Protestantism was a revolt against the Catholic ecclesiastical hierarchy, the Pope. Right? And Protestantism was, like Hinduism, a very decentralized form of Christianity. There was no ecclesiastical order in Protestantism. It rebelled against the idea that to access divine truth, you needed the Pope. and representatives of the Pope. Right? Or the very idea of an English Bible as opposed to a Latin Bible was premised upon what notion? The notion that you and I, because we are the masses, we only know English, we don't know Latin, we don't know, yeah, right? We know only Kannada, not Sanskrit, right? So we can, if it's if the sacred books are in the vernacular, then we can also understand. We don't need interpreters given by the Pope. Right? So for Benedict Anderson, fine, there is some relationship between power and knowledge, but there is this idea, modern technologies of imagination are not simply available to knowledge and power elite, but also to the people at large. Its uses can be multiple. It can be deployed to construct alternative ethnicities, alternative nationalities, alternative identities, some of which may undermine the existing elite, order, and categories. Right? The imagined community called nation was not imagined to begin with by the Pope or by the princes. Because it hurt them. They had to, at the very least, they had to incorporate that. Right? So this is a fundamental difference between the constructivist literature that you've read. This is why the postmodernist child in the constructivist family is very different from other children. Right? Very different from other children. The knowledge elite may indeed construct narratives that in turn create newer identities, but the process is not one-sided, just follows from that. They may also have to construct categories and narratives that are closer to ground realities. This is the idea that princes can be nationalist, of course. Right? But then they are responding to categories that are emerging from below, or what they think are the categories emerging from below, or sentiments emerging from below, ideas emerging from below. Both processes can create enduring national and ethnic identities. This is not a top-down process, certainly at the time of its origin. So postmodern constructivists do not believe that facts are impossible to establish, or that the insertion of trivial incidents into available prisms of interpretation in many situations is enough to suggest that it can be done everywhere at all times. But basically, what would be called an epistemological position, right, would be whether facts can be established or not is an empirical question, not a theoretical question.